It's fossil fuels that cause climate change. There's no way to tackle climate change without tackling fossil fuel polluters.
Canada is fairly conservative relative to a number of countries. We're not necessarily the country that we might think we are in terms of being the green good guys that you often perceive when we do international work.
The political and ideological divide is absolutely enormous in Canada.
We need to change now if we want to give ourselves a fighting chance against climate change.
Climate change remains one of the most pressing issues of our time, challenging communities, economies, and ecosystems across the globe. In Canada, the impacts are becoming increasingly visible, from coast to coast to coast, affecting everything from severe weather patterns, food security, and cultural identity, to health and well-being and national energy policies. As Canadians grapple with these changes, understanding public perception and attitudes toward climate action is more critical than ever. Canada is full of amazing people with diverse opinions. Let's explore how these diverse opinions and regional differences shape Canada's approach to this global challenge. So today we're diving into the findings of a 2024 report from ReClimate titled, "What Do Canadians Really Think About Climate Change?" This comprehensive report, crafted by a team of expert researchers, synthesizes public opinion polls and studies across Canada to explore the nation's diverse views and trends concerning climate change and environmental policies. And you can find links to the full report and the associated webinar in the description below. Now let's take a high-level look at the current state of Canada's feelings on climate change.
Pre-pandemic, climate was actually a very significant priority. It's dropped about by half over the past few years.
We saw kind of escalating support that kind of was sustained through COVID, and then we've lost momentum.
So with that declining support in mind, the report provided an overview of Canada's current perception on climate change and divided it into what they call headwinds and tailwinds. Tailwinds include a growing awareness of the impacts of climate change, driven by increased personal experience with extreme weather events, which may foster greater engagement and support for climate action. However, the headwinds are significant. There is still a notable resistance to policies like the carbon tax, and economic concerns such as the affordability of transitioning to clean energy solutions. Both of these present substantial challenges. But not every Canadian is the same, and factors like personal beliefs, age, gender, and political ideologies can all influence the perception Canadians have on climate change. Speaking of political differences, according to the findings, there's a clear split among the major political parties. Supporters of the New Democratic Party, or NDP, as well as the Liberal Party, show strong favoritism towards aggressive climate policies, aligning closely with the scientific consensus on the need for urgent action. Additionally, NDP and Liberal voters also tend to strongly hold the belief that the recent severe wildfires are due to ongoing climate change. On the other hand, the Conservative Party of Canada backers tend to be more skeptical and prioritize economic concerns, suggesting a cautious approach to environmental legislation. In addition to political leanings, age and gender also play a big role in a person's feelings on climate change.
There are noticeable variations based on age and gender in attitudes toward climate change and support for climate action in general.
The younger Canadian population, especially those under 30, see climate change as a dire issue that demands significant and immediate action. This is in stark contrast to older generations, who might weigh economic stability more heavily and show some resistance to rapid changes. Additionally, The report highlights that women generally express greater concern for climate change compared to men and are more supportive of decisive environmental policies. But Canada is a big place, and not all provinces and territories feel the same. For example, in Quebec, the situation is quite different than a lot of other provinces.
Where climate is not a controversial issue.
The report highlights that in Quebec, there is a broader consensus on the perception of climate change compared to other regions in Canada. The public opinion research shows that Quebecers generally prioritize climate change more consistently and are supportive of measures to address it.
When you aggregate all the polling numbers from Canada, you have this picture of an intense debate around climate issues and policies. The way it is experienced on the ground in the prairies in BC, in Quebec, in the Maritimes is not the same, and we should be communicating the same.
And this just highlights that while it can be useful to take a nationwide look at things, we also need to think about the regional differences in the way climate change impacts different people, and the associated way climate change may or may not be perceived. In Canada, the magnitude of climate warming and effects are felt very different if you're in a northern or coastal or prairie or terrestrial area, and we need to have empathy for the unique way climate change impacts our neighbors. So how do we start to make sense of this data? Well, the report outlines a model that highlights the unstable beliefs that persist across Canada. And the reason for these unstable beliefs are things like solutions aversion, or how our willingness to accept action and solution can be primarily governed by political ideologies. Additionally, distracted attention is a large reason for the unstable beliefs we are seeing. The last 5 years have been a roller coaster.
Several breaking developments tonight in the coronavirus outbreak.
And all this can cause climate change awareness to take a backseat. There's also the perception gap and the distance gap to consider. The perception gap is basically a means of conforming to social norms.
That means that essentially what we have is this thinking in our minds, well, I'm concerned about it, but nobody else is. Therefore, we're not creating social expectations for us to do something about climate change. So this perception gap is actually very important.
While the distance gap has a lot to do with out of sight, out of mind for many Canadians who are not directly feeling the impacts of climate change.
That we perceive climate change as something that's going to happen to others in the future. Even though we have a higher awareness of the impacts of extreme events, we're not personally in great numbers feeling the effects of that. We may feel more empathy now and concern for what's going on, but those gaps from the perspective of will climate affect me personally remain.
There's also the potential for misinformation and counter-campaigning to cause unstable beliefs amongst the public.
You look at Canada as a country, there are political forces actively trying to derail the federal carbon tax, actively scorning electric vehicles, playing up the contribution of fossil fuel or the fossil industry to our national well-being.
With all this in mind, there really is no surprise that support for climate action and climate change is unsteady in Canada. So how do we turn things around when it comes to Canada's feelings on climate change?
The empathy has to come first if your communication is going to get across at all.
Well, it starts with empathy. Empathy is crucial in discussing climate change in Canada, as it helps bridge diverse perspectives and fosters a more inclusive dialogue that acknowledges and addresses the varied impacts on different communities. We also need to bring a personal touch to the messaging moving forward.
To tell more compelling stories, more personal stories, more vivid imagery that involve climate change and its effects on people.
And while it's important to be direct and blunt about the realities of climate change,
remind people that climate change is real, that it's human caused, and that it's affecting us today. Those three issues need to be in every communication that we're doing.
We also need to be mindful of how fear-mongering can impact mental health.
An alarming 54% of the population of Quebec said to pollsters that they experienced some form of eco-anxiety.
As we reflect on the insights from the report, it's clear that while Canada faces significant challenges in addressing climate change, there is also substantial momentum and public support for meaningful action. The consensus in regions like Quebec and the growing awareness across the country provide a strong foundation for transformative policies. By harnessing these tailwinds and navigating the headwinds with strategic communication and empathy, Canadians can unite to forge a sustainable and resilient future. Together, we have the opportunity to lead by example and make a substantial impact on our planet's health for generations to come. While no individual is directly responsible for climate change, each of us holds the power to shape the future through our actions and choices. Regardless of your skills and abilities, there's a role you can play in crafting a more sustainable world. Let's embrace our unique contributions and work together to carve a path towards a healthier planet for us all. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.